Hello and welcome back to my channel. It's been so long since I've gotten to do something like this and I am so excited to be back at it. So what my goal was for today is I was going to make, I don't think they're called overlays, but maybe some overlays for Twitch. Because I plan on streaming there this Saturday. I'm not sure what time. I will broadcast it out on my Twitter and stuff like that. And my Twitch will be in the link for the description here. But I wanted to make some like in-between screens, like if the stream is starting, a break, and an end screen. And what I was going to do is just use some of my art with some text over top. The issue is, when going through all of my art, I realized I never ever draw landscapes. I only ever do portraits or perfectly square. So obviously what I have to do instead is draw some of these first. So I think the next couple of videos I'm going to do are going to be me doing the drawings for these Twitch overlays. And so what I'm drawing today is called a Kitsune. So a Kitsune, it means fox in Japanese. They're a yokai, which is like a Japanese folklore creature. And they're typically drawn with many tails, usually 9. And they're shapeshifters. They can transform into men or women, and they're in a lot of stories that portray them as like tricksters, like foxes are in other forms of folklore, or as, you know, guardians, friends, and sometimes lovers. So I see a lot of like human kitsune, but I kind of just wanted to do a straight up fox with 9 tails. And I thought that would be an interesting way to fill that composition of the landscape piece without having to do an intricate background, which I was just not feeling up to. So I have, you know, the tails on one side and the tails on the other kind of blowing in the wind. I didn't have a strict reference for this one like I sometimes do with my other pieces. This was sort of just free-flowing, and I looked up references when I needed them, especially surrounding the markings on the kitsune's face, because I wanted to get those kind of accurate, and some of the other markings on their tail and body. I wanted to really like show what a kitsune would look like, because I wanted them to be kind of like intricate looking. So what was really important to me with this one was getting the tails really flowy looking, like they're blowing in the wind, and making her look magical and elegant. So I originally started out doing like a flower pattern on both her head and her back, but I decided to do a more traditional kitsune mask. And for her back and her leg, I did a scalloped pattern instead, because that's seen in a lot of Oriental art, while being something that's relatively easy to do while looking extremely intricate just from a distance. A lot of the reference pictures I was looking up for Kitsune are white with red. I know I definitely wanted to do the red, but I wasn't sure about making her fur completely white. So instead I do her more in traditional fox colors, because I really wanted to work with bright saturated reds. And I'm actually really happy with the way it looks. I'd like to maybe go back and see if I can change the colors around a little bit to see what a white version would look like, but I'm pretty happy with the version that I chose to do. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just doing the line art. I finished my sketch, really working on the detail of those scallops, and I do eventually go back in and color all of the line art. I wanted to make it look a bit more non-illustrative, I guess. I'm not sure the word I'm quite looking for, but the black line art wasn't something I really wanted to keep, especially in the red areas or the scalloped areas, because I feel like that black color with such intricate details would dominate over the red a little bit. even though red is a very dominant color. I think black is even more dominant. I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up. If you see, I bounce around a lot trying to do these lines, because if I can't do one, sometimes doing another one will help me figure out what the line or the shape is supposed to look like. For example, you know, doing one of the ones up top might show me how I actually want to curl the tail, or make sure that all the curls aren't looking exactly the same. This sort of like wavy curl pattern on the tips of the tails was something I saw in a lot of Kitsune, sorry, not Katsune. And it was a pattern I sort of carried throughout the illustration in the tips of the tails, the tips of the ears, and the tips of the paws. Something really annoying about this drawing. My fill bucket tool was not working, and it wasn't my lines, because I do go back and test it, and I tried restarting my program and nothing worked. So I had to color everything by hand, which was a little bit tedious, but you know, slightly meditative. Probably added 30 to 45 minutes to my whole thing. And kind of because of that fill bucket tool issue, I had a little bit of trouble with shading as well. I am pretty happy with how the shading turned out though. It wasn't exactly where I thought it was going in the beginning, but it ended up somewhere that I liked. I picked a really vibrant red for the red parts of the Kitsune. Just because, you know, I knew in my head that I was going to be doing not a white version, so I really needed a saturated red to stand out against the sort of more natural reddy orange that a fox typically is. I do end up actually putting a layer style on top of it that makes it even more bright, so I didn't quite go hard enough with the contrast at first, just because doing that red against white is already so intense, but I needed to go harder. Sometimes you'll see that I fill in a space bigger than I need to and then cut the space out. That's not for any reason. I just do it because sometimes it's easier to not get frustrated at overfilling a space and carving it back out than having to like go in with the little tiny details. So if you're ever getting frustrated with having to fill in, you know, lots of tiny details and you're doing things where you can erase, like digital work, I would recommend overfilling the lines and then going back and cutting them out, just because it reduces the pressure of coloring outside the lines, I think, which stops you from being so paralyzed that, oh my gosh, I'm gonna color outside the lines, because you can always go back in and carve it out, at least in digital work. In other stuff, it's not so easy. So I did start out with a little bit more saturated of an orange and then rolled it back a little when I realized that the contrast wasn't really doing so great against the red, and I did want the facial markings to really stand out, so I did the face white. Foxes, I think, typically have a little bit of a blaze on their face and their snout that it's sort of whitish, and of course the white chest. I went in and colored the line art on the red parts a more pink color, just because I thought the lighter line art would make a really interesting effect, and it does. I use a darker line art for, I think, the rest of the line art for the fox, the Kitsune. But I do like the way the light line art especially looks against the scallops and against the swirls on the paws. I think that ended up really well. I also did these kind of like, I don't know what they are. They're like earrings or pins or tassels, some kind of like jewelry. A lot of the Kitsune I saw had bells around their neck, so I did that. But also those like red tassels on the ear, there's one on the chest, there's also like 2 buttons on the chest. It was just a lot of what I was seeing in the research I was doing for this. So I start out shading with a blue tone because I thought it would contrast really well with the bright reds of the fox. However, it kind of doesn't work out the greatest. Instead of making an interesting like contrast like I hoped it would or thought it might, it kind of just grayed everything out, which was a little bit annoying because I really wanted the brightness, the saturation, especially of the reds, to come through, and this blue is just really toning it down. So I do go and I use my color balance tools to change it to more of a red shading rather than a blue. And I'm using the wet blender just because I wanted it to look a little bit more rendered and also a little bit more like ethereal, and the wet blender also kind of does an interesting job of making it look fuzzy like hair, so I don't have to go in and do a ton of hair shading, which I didn't really want to do with so many tails. It's a lot. So I'm going back in with another layer of that shading, just doing a little bit of like harder shade in some areas, catching up where the blender might have blended it out too much. I do go in again with an even harder shade and then blend out the edge of that, just because I'm really trying to create that contrast. I do try to do some hair shading, but the issues with the paint bucket, along with like the way I layered everything, was making it really hard to blend out using the wet mixer brush, which is what I usually do for hair. So instead I kind of just do lines that are not blended out. They're a little bit more illustrative, but they still contribute to the idea of hair, you know? I went in with a little bit more saturated of a red, and I'm doing a bit of a darker shade here. Originally I was going to make it an exclusively hard shade. I wasn't going to do any blending, but then in some places it was starting to look a little bit strange. So I did take the wet mixer and go around the edges. Not blending it out as much as some of the others, but still, you know, not making it stand out quite so harshly against a lot of the other shading that I did. And I think that really bumped up the contrast in a good way. Yep, here I am adding in the stripes of hair, just a little bit to like guide the eye in the way the hair is moving. I did a layer of dark and a layer of light. I was going to do another layer of light on top, but I just wasn't feeling it, so I kind of just left it at the two. And I was trying to do the same thing with the tips of the tails with some white, but I wasn't liking that, so instead I went in with a pinkish color and I did swirls instead. So that, you know, continues that swirl motif that was going on, while still adding some texture to the tips of the tails, so it maybe looks a little bit more like hair, quote unquote. I don't know, it's a magical creature. So I do another little bit of color balancing and some shading on the bells and jewelries. And then I decide that I want I do flip it back and forth between the white one here, but I decided to keep it red. I decide I want a paper texture, so I go online and I find a little bit of a roughed up paper texture and throw it on back of that with a multiply layer. And interestingly enough, when I browsed through them, I really liked how one of the overlays, I can't remember what it is, one of them really brightened up those reds and oranges, really just bumped up that contrast exactly the way I wanted it. So I went back in and added a layer of that. So then I go in with a soft light layer and some yellow and blend that out with the wet blender, lower the opacity, make it really soft looking, and that adds to the lighting and the hair texture as well, giving it some more highlights and lowlights. And I do a little bit of red, that blending on the tips of the tails as well. I really like this. I feel like it makes it look a lot more dynamic, a lot more standout-ish. I do throw a dark background on top and then start carving out the light, which is what I like to do sometimes. But I didn't like how it dampened out the colors that I just made so vibrant. So I decided to scrap that and just keep this. I also wanted to make her eyes kind of glowy, kind of red. So I think I did a hard light layer on that one and blended it out using the wet blender, and then took my eraser and erased out her eyes so you can still see the white of her eyes. Basically, that is it. So a reminder that this Saturday I'm going to be streaming on Twitch. My Twitch is in the description, and I will announce when I am streaming on my Twitter, which is allthatjazz with 1Z_YT, and that'll also be in the description. I would bet afternoonish, maybe 2, maybe 3. And I'm not sure how long I'll be streaming for. I'll just be working on something for my next video, so I'd love to see you there. Oh, I forgot I did this. I added I added dots all around the scallop pattern and also on her tail to sort of make a more intricate looking pattern. But I hope to see you at my stream. Thank you so much for watching. I am so out of practice with the commentary thing. I'm umming and umming all over the place. I know it's super annoying. I'll get back used to it in just a little bit. So thank you again so much for watching, and have a lovely day and all that jazz.